Questioning the sanding gospel. If you've spent any time in woodworking, you've probably heard the advice that the key to a great finish is sanding. Lots and lots of sanding. The common wisdom suggests that you should keep working your way up through the grits, making the wood smoother and smoother until it feels like glass. The thinking is simple. A perfectly smooth surface will lead to a perfectly beautiful finish. But what if I told you that this idea, while well-intentioned, could be the very thing that's ruining your projects? When it comes to applying stain, the mantra of smoother is always better starts to fall apart, and it's important to understand why. This might sound like I'm telling you to do less work, and in a way, I am. But it's about working smarter, not harder. The assumption that wood behaves like other materials, such as metal or plastic, is where many woodworkers go wrong. When you polish a piece of metal, you're creating a reflective, non-porous surface. A smoother surface on metal means a more brilliant shine, and that logic makes perfect sense. Wood, however, is a completely different animal. It's a natural, organic material filled with millions of tiny pores. It's more like a sponge than a sheet of steel. It's this porous nature that allows it to absorb a finish, particularly a pigment stain. The entire process of staining relies on these open pores. The pigments in the stain need to find a home, and that home is inside the wood fibers. When you apply stain, it soaks into the surface, coloring the wood from within. This is fundamentally different from paint, which simply sits on top of the wood and forms a film. So, if the goal is to get the stain into the wood, we have to ask ourselves a critical question. What does aggressive sanding do to those all-important pores? This is where the conventional wisdom of sanding until the wood is impossibly smooth starts to become a problem for us. Challenging this long-held belief isn't about cutting corners. It's about understanding the material you're working with. Before you grab that sheet of 320 grit sandpaper for your next staining project, take a moment to reconsider the goal. Are you preparing a surface, or are you accidentally sealing it off? The truth is that for staining, there is a sweet spot. A point of diminishing returns where more sanding not only stops helping but actively starts hurting your final finish. We need to stop thinking about sanding as just a way to make things smooth and start thinking about it as preparing the wood to accept a finish in the best possible way. To really see what's going on, let's move away from theory and get our hands dusty with a simple, practical experiment. It's the kind of test you can and should do in your own shop before starting any large project. I took a single, ordinary board of red oak, a popular wood known for its prominent grain and pores. I then divided this board into 4 distinct sections. Using the same board is crucial because it ensures that any differences we see in the final finish are due to our sanding process, not variations in the wood itself. Uniformity is the key to a good scientific test, even in a dusty workshop. Each section of the board was then sanded to a different final grit. The first section was sanded only up to 120 grit. The second section was sanded progressively up to 180 grit, a common and highly recommended stopping point for many woodworkers. The third section was taken a step further, sanded all the way to 220 grit, another popular choice that many believe provides the ultimate balance. Finally, the fourth section was sanded to a very fine 320 grit, chasing that ultra-smooth, polished feel that we've been taught to aim for. After sanding, I made sure to clean each section thoroughly with a tack cloth to remove all the dust. This is an important step because leftover dust can interfere with stain absorption and create a blotchy, uneven mess. With the surfaces prepped and ready, I applied the exact same oil-based pigment stain to all 4 sections at the same time and with the same applicator. I let the stain penetrate for the same amount of time on each section before wiping off the excess. This controlled approach ensures that the only variable influencing the outcome is the final grit of sandpaper used on the wood. Even before the stain was fully dry, the differences were immediately apparent. This simple side-by-side comparison is one of the most powerful tools a woodworker has. It takes the guesswork out of finishing and replaces it with clear, visual evidence. Instead of blindly following a rule you read somewhere online, you can see with your own eyes how your specific wood, your specific sandpaper, and your specific stain all interact with each other. The results of this little experiment might just surprise you and change the way you approach sanding forever. Now, let's take a closer look at what happened to each section. Let's break down what our experiment revealed, section by section. The first area, sanded to just 120 grit, showed the darkest color of all four. The stain soaked in deeply and aggressively, which might sound good at first. However, upon closer inspection, the surface wasn't ideal. You could still see fine scratches left behind by the coarse 120 grit sandpaper. These tiny grooves, often called pigtails if you're using a random orbit sander, became even more obvious once the dark stain filled them in. While the color was rich, the overall clarity and quality of the surface were compromised. It was a classic case of one step forward, one step back. Next, we examined the section sanded to 180 grit. Here, things started looking much better. The color was still deep and vibrant, almost as rich as the 120 grit section, but the surface was significantly improved. The scratches were gone, and the stain appeared much more even and consistent across the wood. The grain patterns were crisp and well-defined. This section represented a fantastic balance. It was smooth enough to look and feel great, but the wood's pores were still open enough to accept a healthy amount of stain. This is why so many experienced woodworkers swear by stopping at 180 grit. It simply delivers excellent results without any unnecessary extra steps. The third section, sanded to 220 grit, was very similar to the 180 grit section. The surface felt slightly smoother to the touch, and the finish was just as clean and clear. However, a keen eye would notice a subtle but definite lightening of the color. The stain didn't seem to penetrate quite as deeply as it did on the 180 grit surface. For many projects, the difference might be negligible, and 220 grit is still an excellent stopping point for achieving a beautiful, stained finish. It provides a silky smooth surface while still allowing for good stain absorption, making it another top contender for the ideal final grit before staining. Finally, we looked at the last section, the one sanded all the way to 320 grit. The result here was dramatic and undeniable. The surface felt incredibly smooth, almost like a sheet of plastic, but the color was noticeably weaker and more washed out than all the other sections. It was as if the stain struggled to find its way into the wood. The rich, deep tone we saw on the 120 and 180 grit sections was gone, replaced by a much paler version. The wood simply refused to take the stain properly. This section proved our point perfectly. Sanding to a very high grit before staining doesn't improve the finish. It actively prevents it from reaching its full potential. So, what is the scientific reason behind this phenomenon? Why does sanding to a finer grit result in a lighter color? The answer lies in a process called burnishing. When you sand with progressively higher grits, especially something as fine as 320 grit, you're not just cutting and abrading the wood fibers anymore. The fine abrasive particles, combined with the heat and pressure from the sanding motion, start to polish the surface. This action compresses the soft wood fibers, essentially folding them over and mashing them down into the pores. You are, in effect, sealing the wood with its own material. Think of it like this. A surface sanded to 180 grit has open, receptive pores, like tiny valleys ready to be filled with stain pigment. But a surface sanded to 320 grit has those valleys smoothed over and paved shut. The stain, which needs to soak in, is now left sitting on a much less absorbent surface. It can't penetrate deeply, so most of the color is wiped away when you remove the excess stain. You're left with a finish that lacks the depth, richness, and character you were hoping for. You've essentially created a barrier that blocks the very thing you're trying to apply. This effect is especially pronounced in closed-grain woods like maple or cherry, which are already less porous to begin with. Sanding these woods to a high grit before staining can lead to a blotchy, frustrating mess, as the stain takes hold in some random spots, but is repelled from the burnished areas. Even with open-grained woods like the oak in our experiment, the effect is clear and significant. You've spent all this extra time and effort sanding, only to make it harder for your stain to do its job. It's a perfect example of how more work doesn't always lead to a better outcome in woodworking. It's crucial to understand that all this extra sanding isn't just a waste of time and sandpaper, it actively undermines your goal. You're fighting against the nature of the wood and the stain. The goal of sanding before staining is to prepare a uniform surface with open pores that are ready to accept color. By going too far, by chasing that glassy smooth feel, you inadvertently close the door on your stain. The result is a weaker, less vibrant finish that doesn't do justice to the beautiful wood underneath. It's a common mistake born from a simple misunderstanding of how wood works. Now, it's important to clarify that 320 grit sandpaper isn't a useless tool that should be banished from your workshop. It has its place, but that place is typically not right before applying a pigment stain. If your plan is to use a clear finish only, like polyurethane, shellac, or lacquer, then sanding to a higher grit can be beneficial. These are film finishes, meaning they create a protective layer that sits on top of the wood rather than soaking into it. In this case, a smoother surface can indeed lead to a smoother final top coat. The finish isn't trying to penetrate, so burnished pores aren't an issue. The key is to sand with intention. Before you even touch a piece of sandpaper to your project, ask yourself, what is my finishing plan? If the answer involves a stain that needs to soak into the wood, your sanding process should stop at 180 or, at most, 220 grit. This will give you a surface that is smooth enough to eliminate scratches, but porous enough to accept stain beautifully, resulting in a deep and even color. This approach saves you time, sandpaper, and the frustration of a weak, washed-out finish. It's about efficiency and effectiveness, not just mindless effort. This brings us to the most important piece of advice in all of woodworking. Always test on a piece of scrap. Before you commit to finishing your masterpiece, grab an offcut from the same board. Divide it into a few sections and test your entire sanding and finishing schedule from start to finish. Sand one section to 180 grit and another to 220 grit. Apply your stain and top coat to both. Let them dry completely, and then compare the results in good light. This small 5-minute test can save you hours of work and potential heartbreak, giving you the confidence that your chosen method will produce the look you want. So it's time to rethink your sanding habits. Let go of the idea that you must sand until the wood feels like polished marble for every project. Understand that sanding is not a one-size-fits-all process. It's a preparatory step that must be tailored to your specific finish. For staining, stop at 180 or 220 grit. For clear, film-forming finishes, feel free to go higher if you wish. By sanding with a clear purpose and always testing your process, you'll move beyond simply following rules and start making informed decisions that lead to consistently amazing results. Your projects will thank you for it,